the idea of investigating technology through a humanistic point of view is something that is very important.
I've always found architecture to be a bit of a secret society, a bit like marketing in a way. It can be easy from the outside to view it as just creative thoughts and conceptual designs with no science behind them, as the output is so visual. Yep, science is integral to the design and build of, well, everything. As technology becomes more advanced right across the construction space, from the design software we use to create innovative looking buildings to the product development of materials that allow these buildings to become a reality, these changes mean that an architecture's transition from pencil, paper, and ruler to keyboard, mouse, and software have given rise to even more scope to design and build structures that were once only ever classified as futuristic. And the usage of new building materials means that the way these structures are being built physically is also changing. It's important we don't overlook the catalyst for all this change, however. Us, humans, the societies we live in, the cultures that surround us, and the demands of a new generation mean that the human element within architecture is not forgotten, and we still build to cater for these changing needs and wants. This coexistence, the rise of a digitized architectural space, and the changing requirements of the generations lead us to multiple questions about how technology is, and perhaps will, shape the design of future structures, as well as the ever-present humanistic side of architecture. So let's fathom all this out, shall we? Our guest today is Giuseppe Bono, an Italian and British registered architect and computational designer. Giuseppe is the current Associate Director in Computational Design and Emerging Technologies at TP Bennett, and that is a mouthful. I think I'll only say that once here. Giuseppe holds a Master's in Architectural Computation and Architecture and Construction Engineering, with over 10 years of international experience in the construction industry, from computational design to built realizations. Giuseppe has worked in several countries around the world and has contributed to lectures and international conferences. He's published several papers on the relationship between digital technologies and human progress, and he is the author of the book Blue Papers, Studies on Digitational Architecture. Giuseppe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Did I miss anything from that intro?
I think it was pretty accurate. So
fantastic. Right, let's get right into this. I finished that intro talking about the title of your book, Blue Papers. So one thing I want to clear up right at the start. What is digitational architecture?
Yeah. So the word digitation in itself, it doesn't exist, at least to my knowledge. Is a combination of two words, like digital and computational, and it's and the reason why I named the book in that way is because the book itself is based on the research that comes from a binary point of view, in which looking at the current technological development inside architecture. So from one side, looking at a matter of technological development, as I said, but also on the other side as a sort of human progress. And therefore, the two words that I combine, digital and computational, the meaning of it in the book is considered through the human progress point of view. Just to be clear, in a way, a bit like Negroponte did with his seminal book, Being Digital, where he connected the technological development during the 90s through the changes that development was causing inside human perception, and how people were also changing their behavior according to that. And computational, the meaning of the word itself. So a series of mathematical calculations to achieve certain results. It's basically attributing, obviously, digital has multiple meaning. It's basically is converting analogical things into digital format. But in the particular case of the book, it was more to highlight the humanistic point of view. That is actually a very important part of the book itself.
Okay, cool. So when we talk about digital architecture and computational architecture, what's the actual difference here?
In my point of view, is digital architecture is a kind of contradiction in itself. It's a kind of paradox,
Okay.
if you want, because if we consider digital architecture or the word digital itself as a sort of conversion between from the analogic world into digital realm, it's something that in architectural term it's quite impossible to do. It's impossible because obviously architecture manifests itself in a sort of materiality. So architecture is material in itself. Of course, there are multiple ways again that architecture can be considered as well, and someone may argue that it can also be an informational architecture, which is not necessarily real. But digital architecture in itself is something that was used maybe a bit back in the days to highlight the technological development that was emerging, particularly from the 19th onwards. Nowadays, it's a term that is not used probably quite a lot to describe architecture for the contradiction that I have highlighted before. While on the other hand, the computational design, particularly, I would say more than architecture, it's something that, for instance, in my daily work, it's central points, like means using computational tools and methods to develop design solution, to develop and optimize design solution.
Okay, that's pretty clear. I love the fact that you see digital architecture as this counterintuitive thing because it's such a relaxed way of saying it. And
Yeah.
probably a more uneducated way of saying it. What I'd like to do now is move on to the industry itself, and I've got a quote or a paragraph from your book which sets this part of the conversation up nicely. The observations highlighted so far in the book, that is, validate the fact that the contemporary formulation of digital architecture is reaching an impasse. For some, digital architecture is a sum of technological tools. For others, a system of advanced methods. In both cases, the understanding of digital architecture as a historic paradigm shift is still far from completion. And such a delay of understanding represents a significant part of the confusing and slippery territory in which architecture is currently developed. So, all that being said, it summarizes what we were talking about quite nicely, really. But as an industry, in terms of architecture, where are we right now?
Well, I mean, there is obviously, I always tend to, and this is probably something that I should have said in the beginning. In my view of architecture has always like double output. So, and that is due to the fact probably of for me being coming from a Latin culture and now working into a more Anglo-Saxon way of thinking. And when I highlight this distinction, I think it's quite important because particularly I believe in Latin culture, having experienced both of them, the humanistic part of things. So the idea of investigating technology through a humanistic point of view is something that is very important. While in an Anglo-Saxon way of working, technology is seen more in practical terms. And this dualism is something that, in a way, I always use when I evaluate architecture. So if I have to evaluate architecture, obviously, according to my personal point of view, through a sort of humanistic point of view, and looking back at history, we see that architecture has developed quite a lot, quite significantly in the last 50 years. We went through different periods and different style is always an ambiguous word, but different approach to consider architecture. We've been after modernism, we went through postmodernism, then there was deconstruction, then non-standard architecture at the beginning of the 21st century, where we were experimenting even more with new design technologies that were coming up. And last decade, there was a very strong how can I say, introduction inside the discipline of automated systems, so robotics, etc. And now we are in the age of artificial intelligence. So this is going to affect a lot also how architecture, how we design and perform architecture at the moment as well. We can see that obviously in the last 50 years we went through a sort of clusterization of architecture itself. So there has been a huge amount of pluralism that was possible to reach thanks to the introduction of multiple technologies. The technologies that nowadays we consider disrupted, we consider emerging. We can use any word that we want, but in reality they are fragmenting the profession itself. And what we're producing nowadays is obviously affected by a sort of variety that I believe it's very difficult nowadays to answer what is architecture today, because it's multiple things. It's a series of multiple things, and since the technological development that we're going through is so important, is so crucial for this development, if this technological development is so pluralistic, also the outcomes that come from it and the way that we use these new technological tools into our design process produce multiple types, if you want to call types, style, whatever you want to call, of architecture. So it's very difficult, I believe, nowadays, label architecture with a single word, and I think this is also part, or all of the things that I've just said so far is also part of the reason why defining digital architecture or a definition of a digital architecture didn't probably succeed.
You picked out a few things there in terms of where the industry currently is and digital and the design of buildings, which I want to come on to next, which will lead us nicely on to looking at materials and how buildings are actually built. But there was a Harvard University study called "The Limits of Digital Architecture: Interpretation versus Data," and there was a sentence in there that said data and information lie on the side of logical consistency, while architecture lies on the side of cultural understanding. If these two concepts are combined, it must have an impact on the design of a building. So with that in mind and what we've been talking about, where do you see this digitization, if I can use that word, in how we build buildings? Is it changing the way we actually design buildings, or is it just creating efficiencies and all that creativity comes from the culture and humans?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very interesting question, because I think the more obviously we dig deep into new disruptive technologies, the more we tend to detach ourselves from the reality. And this technology allows even us to build completely, I would say, completely virtual architecture. Like there are at the moment, for instance, also new practices, new architectural firms that are based on designing inside a metaverse, so inside a virtual environment, and therefore this environment, they becomes obviously an environment where we can experiment the most with this technology, with these new digital technologies. But when we look at the real world, there is certainly a sort of a certain level of limitations, like limitation that is simply based, obviously, on, for instance, I don't know, fabrication methods. I mean, we know that we can design performative building, we can optimize them, we can make use of less material, optimize them structurally, make them more sustainable, and so on and so forth. But obviously, converting this design, this advanced design, and this optimization procedure into reality is not always easy, because it requires a certain level, obviously, of optimization and efficiency also in the construction process. And that's why I believe that that's the biggest step that we still have to make, because if you consider just one thing, if you consider that obviously in the last 60 years, the world population has increased for 4.5 billion. And there are also predictions that say that up to 2050, there will be probably other 2.6 billion people that they will require houses, they will require a place where to live. And even nowadays, many of the people that we have, probably almost half of them, they don't live in suitable conditions. So the challenge of building and building more efficiently, it's paramount, and for this using technologies is crucial, because the more you have to build, the more you have to be able to optimize the material that you use, and also the construction processes, because we know that the construction industry is the most has the biggest impact in terms of carbon footprint, and in terms of also other sociological implications, such as the fact that it employs also 7% of the world population, and so on and so forth. So when we consider architecture as a sort of social construction, so we look at architecture through what architecture is able to build for our society and our communities. I think that the use of technologies, of current technologies, I think is important now, but it's going to be even more important in the future, where we will need to save materials, we will need to use natural resources better than what we did so far.
That's interesting. It leads us nicely onto a similar topic in terms of the rest of the industry and the supply chain. You know, architecture is fundamental in the building of the building and how it looks and the materials, but it's also must be fundamental for having an impact on potentially new materials we need, you know, the dependent on the design of a building. So what impacts is architecture having on new materials that we need, or is it the other way around? Are new materials impacting the way we design buildings and do that digitally?
There is definitely, obviously, particularly from how can I say, from a manufacturing point of view, there are constantly new products that are coming into the industry. I think the driving force of that are obviously sustainability requirements. There are certain accreditation that has to be the new building has to comply with. So there is certainly we are developing more and more materials, more efficient materials to use inside constructions. how these materials are affecting architecture, I think, I mean, when we talk architecture, probably I'm talking about architectural design. There is, I think, personally, the biggest impact, and this is probably my point of view as technologist, although I'm probably also, actually not probably, I'm also an architect, but at the moment I'm more focused on the design technology side. I've said the biggest impact is also the procedure that you use to optimize these resources, and obviously there are very important choices that has to be made in choosing the right suppliers, in considering multiple aspects of the product that we used, how they have been sourced, any other aspect like the LCA, the life cycle assessment of the products is becoming more and more important, and we use them quite a lot also to estimate the carbon footprint of our building. But I think personally, I mean, more than that, I personally believe that using technologies to optimize the design, I think it's going to make a huge impact, particularly on the long term of how we design our buildings. And also keep in mind that we know that we have industry targets set up for net zero carbon emission by 2030, I think. Some of the company even that try to do that even by 2025. There is after that the intention also to develop even more efficient system for regenerative design, and therefore building solutions that are able also to produce energy and not only use energy resources. So there's a lot of things going on at the moment. That's why I believe that it has a certain impact. Going back to your question, it has a certain impact of, I mean, on the fact, or in the way that we design buildings, etc. But it will require further development, be even more effective in the future.
So with these stipulations and these targets that we have, as an architect, does that pose challenges? Is it exciting? Is it restrictive? How the necessary and required, but how do you see that purely from an architectural point of view?
I think for me is very, very exciting because this is actually the reason why initially I let's say redirect my career into more design technology rather than architecture. I mean, I started as an architect and doing things that architects normally do, like producing drawings, going on site, and being involved both with the design at different stages, from concept technical towards construction and so on. And I've always found since the beginning of this process a kind of frustration, because I thought these things could be done better. I mean, I was wasting a lot of time in doing my task. I was wasting probably also a lot of materials because by designing in a certain way, you obviously use more material. And when you go on site, you see that this waste become even more because the design, when the design is translated into construction in a traditional way, in a traditional process, there is also to consider the amount of materials that are normally wasted. And this has been the driving force for me to change my career into more design technology, so like to optimize this process, so to be involved into or to be even a small part of this system that has the main focus to building better and more efficiently. And nowadays, obviously, with multiple technologies that are coming into the profession, the landscape is far more wide and quite complicated as well, with AI or with, as I mentioned before, robotics or virtual environments and so on and so forth. But I think for me and my personal attitude, so the attitude of being curious, of knowing things that I don't know, I believe that all these things that are going on at the moment related to design technologies are very exciting. For me, it's literally the things that drives my work daily.
Well,
So
I mean, you can tell that because one chapter in your book is entitled Green Robotics. And that leads me nicely onto construction that will be needed now and in the future. Every time I say in the future, I very much feel like it's not the future. I feel like it's very much present. So firstly, what is green robotics, and how will this and other technology impact design?
well, green robotics for many is it doesn't exist, or like is a kind of a paradox, because the you know someone may argue the fact that robotics is not probably very sustainable because you use lots of probably resources. You have to use a lot of I mean, building with robots is not always, or building a robot not with a robot is not always the most sustainable approach. Also, I think actually it's interesting, some dear friends of mine actually can are arguing the fact that the complexity of this robotic construction are also very difficult to access, and therefore if you consider robotic from a sustainable point of view, and you consider sustainability as also part of accessibility and diversity inside the built environment. Some of them obviously might say that it's very difficult to define robotics something like green. Green, obviously, I mean related to the sustainability issue. But some of the examples that I collect there, I think they clarify the fact that what I mean by green robotics means using robotics to make the built environment, particularly from the fabrication point of view, more efficient. So there is at the moment, and this connects with what I was mentioning before, so using resources in a better way. And you can do that with automated system, with robotic system that are programmed in a way to optimize that. And some of the examples that I'm collecting in the book, they are already doing that. And it's stunning how through this system, through these robotic fabrication methods, you can even building new constructions, saving even 70% of, for instance, if you look at concrete construction, there are even examples where you can build concrete shells, saving even 90% of concrete. And if you apply all these things on a huge scale, like the construction industry, even if you still have 20%, it's going to be times all the buildings that we build. It's going to be a huge savings and a huge impact also from a sustainable point of view, because we know that concrete is one of the main materials in terms of carbon emission. So this is just an example, just to say that that's what I mean by green robotic. It's not like the robots that are sustainable. It's what we can do with them through automated fabrication can allow us to save a lot in terms of natural resources.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we've had a few stop starts in the construction industry in technology and MMC, offsite, and the likes. But it's slowly starting to come through. I feel with a new generation coming through that are more digital native than the current incumbents. But looking towards the future, and I do mean the future now, how far do you think this can go when talking about robotics and things like that? Are we going to see buildings completely designed and then completely built robotically or automated? Or is that just a step too far?
I think you have to consider that, and this is not just something that is related to robotics, but I think in general to the current technological development is that we are obviously nowadays we are involved with multiple technologies, and you have to look at them in a sort of I would say post-human design ecology. And when I say post-human, I don't mean something that is like where humans are completely excluded, so something that is only related to machines and etc. But post-humans means we will be more engaged with these technologies up to the point that they will become like a sort of our partners into the design of new building and into their realization of these new buildings. I mean, someone in the past was already like 50 years ago was already understanding that they're going to be this sort of dualism between an extended designer, which are the human beings, so that use these tools and use these new technologies to design, and also the artificial designer, which are these new systems which are helping us to produce this. So I don't believe that, or at least personally, that when we talk about this technology will replace, humans. Or I don't share this vision that someone maybe the most skeptical think about this. But I certainly think that there will be more and more collaborations between humans and what before we consider tools, but nowadays they become intelligent tools, and that obviously will require us to step forward. So I don't think I was saying that actually quite recently. I don't think it is a call for replacement, what we're going through now. So we're not going to be replaced by these technologies. But I think it's certainly a call for upgrade. Also, we need to, as a professionals, we need to upgrade and be able to understand these technologies and understand the fact that it's not like when we used technology before, maybe 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, where we use software. We produce outcomes with that in a very mechanical way. Now this technology has a higher level of complexity, but also that level of complexity requires a different way to assimilate that or to use them, more collaborative than before. So it's more like, so that's why when we use this technology, I think this is particularly important probably nowadays, is that the approach that we use, the design approach, is a kind of bottom-up approach. So we as humans, most of the time, we set the inputs, we set the parameters that we want to start the process, and then the machine does all the calculation and everything, and provide multiple options and multiple scenarios that we can adapt. In the past was different because the design approach was top to bottom. So we were basically deciding every step of the way. So to go back to your question, I don't think we have nothing to worry about, to be honest. But certainly, we need to like upgrade. Like it's something that is called for a new specializations inside the profession.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting when you talk about architecture, because for most people, I would say that when you mention architecture, you think of grand designs and very different styles and almost bespoke houses or buildings, if you like. Whereas the opposite to that, where there's more efficiencies, and like you rightly said, we need more houses right across the world because a lot of people don't actually live in permanent structures, where technology probably leans itself and a lot more efficiencies in that space and creating them very quickly on a more generic platform. There's two completely different sides of architecture there, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, for me, architecture is construction in aesthetic evolution. So this is the aesthetic value is what characterize architecture. But obviously, this obviously includes a series of implications, and that's why even when you put construction and aesthetic inside the same sentence, you start to realize that there is a sort of scientific way of looking at architecture, which more like into the construction system, fabrication, etc. And there is a more aesthetic, a more ethics way of looking at it, which is come from more humanities. And that's why I think going back to the book, very interconnecting conversation that we're having. That's why I think nowadays we see that this humanistic point of view is fading away. So, like for some reason, which I don't personally understand, and because I don't think they're right, we give more importance to the technology part rather than the humanistic value and all the human implication that comes from this technological development. And while I personally believe that I'm still very interested in that part, because this is actually what helps me to give a meaning to architecture. So to believe that architecture is not only construction, but is construction in aesthetic evolution, and therefore talking about aesthetics is also require discussing about things that they might be obsolete for someone, but I think they're still very relevant if we want to understand, if we want to give a meaning actually to architecture. I mean, we all know that the most famous sentence probably in history of architecture is that architecture is the spirit of our era. There was Mies van der Rohe that was saying that. And if we don't look at architecture in a humanistic point of view, we can understand any spirit of our era, because we cannot understand for what area we are designing. So, and this, I think, is probably my point of view, my personal point of view on this.
Fantastic. I think that's a great way to end. We've come full circle. Started talking about your book, and we've ended talking about the whole ethos of your book and your perspective, which is great. So the book is called Blue Papers, Studies on Digitational Architecture. It's available on Amazon and other retailers, I'm guessing. Check it out. It's really interesting. It'll blow your mind in parts, and you'll have to read. Well, if you're a layman like me, you'll have to read parts over again to understand them. But it is really interesting. So check it out. The link will be in the show notes. And Giuseppe, thank you so much for number one, writing the book, and number two, coming on and discussing all things digital and architectural. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the invitation, and it was great to talk to you.